Hey guys, we're going to be doing a little bit of an interesting video today. Recently, another card game, which is Hearthstone. I know that's a four-letter word around these parts, but Hearthstone has done buffs for the first time ever. Now, buffs aren't new to Tesla, they were new to Hearthstone, so it was kind of a big deal when they were doing it. Tesla has done buffs in the past with cards like Brynjolf and Duke Vedemdren, but not really on a huge scale usually, one or two at a time. And usually they haven't really made a huge impact on the meta. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of take a look at some cards from the past expansions that maybe could be deserving of a buff and maybe would change the game a little bit if they were to receive that buff. So what I've done is I've gone through the 3-pack based expansions and I have picked one card from each color, including Tricolor. Tricolor is kind of its own thing. And thought about a buff for said card. Now, one of the interesting things Hearthstone did with its buffs is it didn't buff bad cards. What it did was it buffed cards that were either very close or were already good. There were cards that were already seeing play that were actually on the buff list. And I think that's a really interesting way to do it because it takes advantage of the digital card game format really well. You have this problem that maybe if we buff it, we're going to have to nerf it again in the future, and that's looked upon as a bad thing, whereas I look upon that as a good thing. I think digital card games have this huge advantage that they're not really taking advantage of right now, and I think buffs on a large scale is a really good start to utilizing that format in a good way. So we are going to take a look at each of the cards. There's 18 total that I will suggest potentially are deserving of a buff and why that is. The first is going to be Wildfire Dragon, reducing its mana from 7 to 6. Now, this already sees play in Dragon Archer. Dragon Archer, not that great of a deck. It would continue to see play in that and push Dragon Archer a little bit, as well as potentially see play in slower mid-range Archer decks. The reason I chose this card for a nerf is twofold. The first is that the 6-mana slot has a ton of powerful cards. They are not afraid of pushing the 6-mana slot. There's 6-mana, 6/7 Slay Attack again. That doesn't see a ton of play in Child of Hersine. And I think it's worth it to maybe keep pushing that. See how powerful a 6-mana card needs to be to see play, because this would be a very powerful card. It would be reasonable stats on curve with a very powerful effect. And most specifically, it would buff dragon decks. Now, the reason you want to focus on dragons in Archer over other things, and we'll talk about a green dragon I'm going to suggest gets a buff later as well, is because the payoff for dragons is the lookouts. It is not Alduin. Alduin appears to be the payoff for dragons, but it's really not, because it's only really in a control shell, and in control versus control, not particularly good because it just gets removed, and control versus aggro comes down too late. So the payoff is really the Blades Lookout and the Woodland Lookout that have very powerful effects if you play on curved dragons. This would help that deck specifically. I think Dragon Archer is a deck worth pushing, and I think this would push Dragon Archer. The next is Redoran Battle Spear with its stat buffed to a 2/3 rather than a 1/3. Now, due to the prevalence of silence in the meta currently, there is just an absolute ton of silence. Weapons carry this big inherent risk, and I think they need to have a very high payoff to be played. Currently, we see only really low-cost items, as well as a couple exceptions in Dawnbreaker and Sentinel Battle Mace for late-game burst, be stuff that sees consistent play. This would be something that buffs both items in general and rally, and it could potentially push new rally decks. There's another card that just came out this season, Captain, that could potentially mix with something like this. If you get a good rally item, you really help those sorts of builds and maybe encourage people to tinker around with some new cards as well. The next one's going to be Guildsworn Bloodluster, down to 6 mana. Now, I have notes that I am reading right now for each card, and one of the notes for this just says expertise sucks. Which it does. It's really unfortunate how bad expertise ended up being, because it really does carry this inherent downside of having to play another card on the same turn. That these cards that maybe would be powerful on curve, you can't really play them on curve without also giving up a card, unless you have like 1 extra mana and a rapid shot, like a ring scenario, you'd be able to do that. But most of the time, this ends up being 8 mana or later is when this has to come down, and that's a problem. It's just not as effective there. This would mean like 7 mana, it could come down with a Firebolt or a Rapid Shot if you have that card. This would be a very powerful card, but I think the fact that it's conditional would keep it in check. So this next one is probably the most drastic change I would suggest, because it kind of just changes the card altogether. We're going to talk about Mistveil Enchanter, and the buff I'm suggesting is to get rid of the condition. This is always just a 4 mana 4/2 ward. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to do this one is because of the current 4-drop slot in blue, which is right now Royal Sage, and I consider it a 4-drop Manic Jack, which is an RNG Clown Fiesta. And it's unfortunate that those are the 4-drop options for blue. Giving them another solid option that has no inherent RNG would be a good thing. It would be very strong, but it would have a weakness to negation that would prevent it from being oppressive or anything like that. And here's the thing. I know you guys hate comparisons to Hearthstone, even though this whole video is kind of that. But as somebody who's played a lot of Hearthstone, there's a card, 4 mana, 4/2 ward, called Cthulhu's Chosen. That was a very, very interesting card to play with. The stat line just makes for some really interesting scenarios where it's kind of like, how much do I play around the buff? It fits in a lot of different archetypes, but it's not overpowered in any single one. It's just like a very nice sweet spot in terms of card power level that I would like to see used. So once again, I have expertise sucks as one of the things for, as one of the notes for this card. Guildsworn Wayfarer. Blue has historically, there's a worry about giving blue another good 2-drop besides Wordcrafter. It has Harpy, but Harpy's not really a 2-drop. It's something that costs 2 and you kind of play later on in the curve. There's been a worry that if blue gets another 2-drop, it could be very, very strong. I don't think you can leave that design space open forever, so I'm willing to say let's try Guildsworn Wayfarer because it's interesting. It promotes a certain type of deck because this promotes actions in a aggressive deck, which is not always something you see out of blue. Like Firebolt's something that's getting cut. Rapid Shot's not necessarily something you always play in these aggro decks. That sort of thing. So I think it would be interesting to move Guildsworn Wayfarer to a 2/3 and see if that's overpowered. I don't think it would be. When you look at a card like Altmer Dragon Knight, it has a higher base, but it is much less snowbally. Obviously, if you go this into Lesser Ward on 1, that's pretty crazy, but I think the game is at a point right now where it wouldn't actually be that oppressive. The next one probably wouldn't make that much of a difference. This is kind of going against my, take good cards and make them better idea. Ash Piercer, one of the worst cards in the game. Let's just take it to 4 mana. It could actually become a decent tempo tool rather than being hyper trash. And it's always nice to kind of push stuff out of the hyper trash range. The 5 attack restriction encourages some other cards that recently have started seeing less play, like Vigilant Ancestor, which saw play when they changed the Dresser Renegade interaction. Could potentially be okay with Ash Piercer, but mostly, if this costs less mana, it's easier to pair on the same turn as a 5-power creature, and that's what you're going to be doing most of the time, so you can use this from a neutral board state. If you have the board state, you can use this as a tempo tool at 4 mana to potentially keep that board state. If you don't, you can use it to try and recover. So I still think it wouldn't see any play, but it would be a lot closer. Alright, so this is probably the most terrifying change I'm suggesting, because I think this card's already pretty solid. Bandit Ringleader. Potentially moving this to 5 mana. This has seen play in Token Spellsword for a while, mostly because Token Spellsword doesn't have the draw options of other classes. It doesn't have Daggerfall Mage, Crusader's Assault. Green never had draw either, but it has seen play in relatively high level decks, but it has kind of fallen off now that Catapult has been nerfed and Spellsword isn't quite as good. I think it's worth pushing this because aggro decks need to go very fast these days. They kind of need a lower cost finisher than what we have right now, which is people using Fervor as a finisher, which is somewhat interesting. Ulfric's Housecarl is another card that is a pseudo finisher because it kind of restocks your hand and lets you keep going into the late game. And I think Bandit Ringleader would be an interesting card to push in that respect because it does reward these token styles and it rewards decks, control decks that are fighting, honestly throughout the entire game, rather than waiting until a certain point using Ice Storm and Debilitate. Those are the kind of control decks you don't necessarily want in the game. The ones that can control earlier on with creatures and basically get your value trades and kind of, play a more honest game on the board, those are the ones you want to be good. And I think if Bandit Ringleader is a card that punishes the more passive control decks, then it's maybe worth pushing, even if this card would be just insanely powerful. Next one's going to be Bruma Oppressor, moving down to 3 mana. The effect is powerful, but with its condition and its cost, it's just not viable. The reason I think this might be okay at 3 mana is because non-token decks can't really play the most powerful yellow 3-drops, those being Resolute Ally and Pit Lion. Those are sort of conditional on having a specific kind of deck. So a mid-range yellow deck that doesn't necessarily run those could potentially look at this as a 3-drop, because this is a very solid tempo tool at 3 mana, reasonable control tool at 3 mana, and you just remove the downside. Not remove the downside, but make the downside less of a big deal. Because I don't think this effect is overly oppressive or anything like that, even though the name of the card is Oppressor, which I'm realizing right now, because it is still conditional. But at 3 mana, I think it's a lot more realistic to potentially put this card in your deck. So next up is Shrine Guardian. Now, Shrine Guardian was a card that saw play for quite a while in the Halalu meta. The effect is very powerful in specific metas, because it can really kind of crush certain strategies in the late game if they don't have the silence to deal with it. But the punishes right now are kind of just too severe at 8 mana. Belligerent Giant and Silence are both just incredibly powerful punishes for playing something this expensive. And I think you need to resolve that if you want to see this card see play. And I think it's a really interesting effect and a really interesting stabilization tool that deserves some exploration. It promotes more creature-based control, and specifically the style of control where we're seeing kind of halfway between mid-range and control, with Guildsworn, with Daggerfall, and with Crusader kind of becoming a thing. I think those decks are worth pushing. I think they're very solid right now, but they're worth pushing, and this could maybe crack those lists and be kind of an interesting card that maybe defines it a little bit more, maybe defines it as control versus mid-range a little bit more, if you drop it down to 7 mana. Next is going to be Serpentine Stalker at a 4/5 stat line. As I talked about it earlier, Archer is kind of the dragon deck you want to focus on, because the payoff for dragons is the Lookouts and not Alduin, and it should be kind of more of a mid-range style, I think, utilizing that card draw and life gain for race purposes or resource extension purposes. And there's just a lot of cards that kind of already focus on mid-range tempo stuff, like Shearpoint Dragon, like Blood Dragon, which already fit into that archetype. So Serpentine Stalker to a 4/5, I think, would help those decks quite a bit. 4 drops in green aren't particularly strong. This would be sort of a consideration in those, although those are not super powerful right now. 4/5s don't see a ton of play right now, and this might not be good enough even at 4/5. But the interesting thing is, it kind of lets you dictate whether you want to race or not, right? You play this in the Shadow Lane, if you've lost field, or even if you have it, you play this in the Shadow Lane, you have the decision on whether you want to go back in field and continue fighting, or just stay in Shadow and continue racing. And I think if you remove some of the downside by adding another stat point, making this just better by itself, you could see that upside maybe really shine. Next is Sai Sahan to 6 mana. The board sweep effect is very powerful, but the high cost means in a mid-range or a control deck, it can't really be paired with anything on the same turn, which is the big problem, because if this is the only thing you're doing, it's usually not enough. This would definitively make him a mid-range card and would buff the slower mid-green decks that kind of died with the Skulk nerf, which usually relied on Skulk Curse, and maybe this would be something that helps them, come back and potentially be a part of the meta again. You do worry about this because it's kind of a snowball card, where if your opponent can't deal with it, it becomes harder and harder to deal with it as your opponent keeps finding curses or rapid shots or things that wound. So at 6 mana, maybe that happening a little bit sooner is dangerous, but I think it's worth it to try and push this card and see if mid-range slower green decks can kind of come back into the meta. Speaking of which, the next one is going to be Blighted Werebat to 4 mana. There is a 3 mana 3/3 drain in the game right now with upside that I would say is perfectly balanced. Golden Initiate's a totally fine card, not overpowered, not underpowered. It's kind of right where it needs to be. So I think a 4 mana 4/4 drain with upside could potentially be around the same thing. It promotes green decks to be a little bit more board based as control, where they usually kind of rely on just kind of recovery tools right now. Things like Gambit for Archer decks, or Debilitated Ice Storm for Telvanni decks. This would promote a maybe different style of green control. This would be very, very powerful. And it might appear oppressive to some people initially, but it wouldn't be as oppressive as it appears, because of the downside of a 4 mana 4/4 in taking field lane. So you can play this Shadow Lane and just keep draining, and that would be very powerful. But if you played Brynjolf before, a lot of the times, if that's just what you're doing and you're not fighting with it, your opponent can just raise it, and that's a problem. All right, next up is Spiny Hodge Mota to a 5/5. There's no current reason to play this over Bleak Coast Troll, and I think that means it deserves to be re-examined. Another 4 mana 5/5 for purple would be kind of oversaturating the effect and might be dangerous, but they already have 2, and both of them are very cuttable in Corrupted Shade and Bleak Coast Stroll. We have proof that this stat line is not oppressive. And I think Spiny Hajimoto is an interesting card that does promote 50 card decks, but the power level is just so low that nobody's really taking a look at it. It would push Mid-Warrior and Sorcerer back, and I think would be interesting. Again, slower mid-range builds could potentially use this in an interesting way if the downside was lower. Alright, so the next one's going to be Frost Troll. And this is a weird one. I'm going to say give this guy charge. This pushes the wound archetype and allows it to self-activate is the big thing. This allows it to run into something if it wants to and kind of activate itself. You don't need a card to pair with it, and that makes it much, much more powerful and makes that archetype much more powerful. Now, some people might look at this and say that'd be very dangerous because you're talking about, you know, big charge damage with stuff like Ring of Imaginary Might or High Hrothgar. I would say that's not that big of a deal. You look at, say, Ring of Imaginary Might. That's a 2-card combo that costs 8 and deals 8 damage, which is the same as Cliff Racer Swift Strike. So I don't think it's that big of a deal, although you can stack like Maple Shield and stuff. Maybe some worry about potential OTKs, but it takes so many cards, and most of them are bad that I wouldn't worry too much about that. The idea is, again, just to remove some of the downside. The downside with Frost Troll being you need kind of a card to activate it or time to activate it, and this would remove some of that by giving it charge. It would be an interesting option, I think, for regular mid-range and control decks. Probably still wouldn't be powerful enough to see play, but I think it would be interesting to look at. So this is probably the second most dangerous buff, I think, after Ringleader. Trespasser's Bane. I'm going to say add the words draw a card to the end of this one. It would replace Indwell Mastermind, which kind of got nerfed to oblivion, as a purple card draw option, and most specifically, it would be a purple card draw option that can't be rezzed with Necromancer. So it's just card draw. It's not card draw that becomes card draw later, and becomes this insane Necromancer chain of never-ending card draw that purple is known for. It would just be the one time you draw a card. Now, the reason this is dangerous is because Control Purple is already really, really good. Tribunal, Ebonheart, and Talvani are all very, very strong archetypes right now, and a card like this would just be very good in the early game if you don't have any creatures, just to shut down even something like a Pit Lion, a Mournhold Trader. Maybe not shut it down, but make it much, much weaker. But I think, again, it's worth trying to push these. Compare this to something like Enchanted Plate. The effect might be a little bit stronger than that, but it's also more situational, whereas Enchanted Plate is always just kind of good. So I think it'd be interesting to see them try to give another card draw option to purple, give another pseudo removal option for purple, and see if that makes these purple decks that are control heavy more too powerful, like oppressively powerful. It might, but I think it's worth giving it a try and maybe taking a card that didn't see any play and has an interesting effect and pushing it in the process. So for the next one, we're moving on to the tricolors. I just picked one tricolor from each expansion. Sorry, not tri. The first is actually a dual color. It's Warrior's Fury. 2 mana for 4/4 is very cheap, but it's also very slow if you compare it to something like Caius' Machinations, which is 2 mana for 6/6 in stats, but is also very slow. This is also conditional, and you having both an item and a creature in hand, which this is stats or tempo, so this needs to happen early, but you're taking the turn off to buff, so there's a lot of inherent downside with a card. I think you can push this a little bit further than 3 mana. Even at 2 mana, I think it might not see any play. It does encourage Daggerfall and Warriors to build more creatively with items. You already have a lot of item synergy in Daggerfall, and I think it would be interesting to explore that a little bit more. And the same thing as Warrior, I talked about it a little bit with Rhetor and Battle Spear, maybe taking some of the mid-game items that don't see any play and making those a little bit more interesting, a little bit better, would be a good way to kind of shake up how those builds are working right now. Next is going to be Covenant Masterpiece. This is going to be a big buff. I want to buff it to 6 mana because this is still at 6 mana, 2 mana more than Battle Mace and a lower damage output, and that's pretty crazy. Covenant needs a better option. Iron's Chosen was an obvious thought for a buff here because it's just so bad, but Dominion has Battle Reeve. Battle Reeve's an okay card that goes in a lot of archetypes. It gets to play that as its try. right now Daggerfall has basically nothing. They play Emmerich out of kind of sufferance, but it's not good. And mid-range Daggerfall, giving it just like one solid option as a tricolor card that it has to include makes the deck building process a lot more fun because you don't feel handicapped. And again, it encourages people to creatively build with items, so going into like the mid and the late game, more so than just playing the low cost items in Battle Mace for burst. And maybe you think about doing some other things like Master of Arms or Master Swordsmith or Seasoned Captain or stuff that could make these builds a little bit different, a little bit more interesting. I think at 6 mana, it's still probably underpowered, but even with a 2 mana buff, I think this is something to look at. And the last, and certainly not least, card I'm going to suggest as a buff is the daddy himself, Dagoth Ur. It is playable at 12 in Control Dagoth. And Control Dagoth is an okay archetype. It struggles against other control decks, unless it is very threat dense, in which case it struggles against the aggro archetypes. But I think you could push it further. This is a cool effect, having all of these keywords. It's a flashy card. People like it. Let's see more of it. Let's make it just a little bit better by putting it to 11 mana. And it may seem like a small change, but being able to pair it with a 1 or a 2 mana card, if you have a Contract or a Ring, is actually a really big deal, because you look at stuff like Rapid Shot to take off a ward and remove something, Harpy to shackle something. You have a lot of potential things you could do with 1 or 2 mana that maybe make those turns a lot better. And I think Dagoth Ur, in that respect, would be a really interesting card to kind of push a little bit, because it's still kind of a control-only card at 11 mana. Maybe the slowest mid-range deck in the world would run it, but it's still kind of a control-only card, and letting control decks do multiple things is the best way to kind of buff those decks. And I think Control Dagoth, super interesting archetype. It's always been very close, but just struggles against other control decks. Buffing it a little bit might be something that makes the experience a little bit more fun for those players. All right, that's going to be it for me today. Again, some of these might actually be overpowered, the suggestions, but the idea of a digital card game is you can always just bring them back down, and there's no problem with it. So let me know what you guys think. If there's any cards you would like to see buffed, any archetypes you'd like to see buffed, it'd be interesting. I think it's interesting to talk about this sort of stuff, although none of this stuff is actually going to get buffed because these are all just completely random cards that I chose. But, mass buffs, it's such a cool idea. And I know Hearthstone's kind of a 4-letter word, but if we're going to steal anything from Hearthstone, it'd be a cool idea to steal. It'd be a cool idea to kind of just take a whole bunch of cards and improve them and make them better and maybe shake up the metagame in that way, even if it's not a super consistent way to do it versus nerfing. Nerfing is more consistent in shaking up the meta than buffing is. I think that's overall why you see nerfing more. Buffing is still an interesting way to do it if you do it on a large enough scale. So I'd be interested to see if anything's on the table in that respect, and be interesting to see what they would choose to buff. Probably be something different than what I chose. But thanks for watching, everybody. See you guys next time.